Britain, France and the US have turned Libya into a bloodbath. At least 50,000 people were killed during the attack, and since then the country's been turned into a patchwork of rival militias fighting out for territory and condemning the country to decades of violence and trauma. The information we were given to justify the war, we now know, is a total pack of lies. There was no mass rape by Gaddafi's soldiers. There were no 10,000 peaceful protesters slaughtered by Gaddafi's soldiers. In fact, we now know there was no mass protest movement. What there was an armed insurgency by long-standing British proxies combined with lynch mob terror against the black Libyan population. The only mercenaries to be involved in the conflict were on NATO's side. The only aerial bombardment in the conflict, real or threatened, was by NATO. This is now all well known, well documented and written about extensively. What I want to talk about here is how this has all affected Africa and the African Union in particular. To see this whole thing in context, we need to think about Africa and the momentous changes that have taken place there in the last 2 decades. At the end of the Cold War, the Western powers were left in a position of being without rivals. This gave them the ability to control Africa basically through economic blackmail. The Western powers were left with a monopoly of finance. That means any African country had to go to the West for finance, for trade, for anything like that, for loans. This meant that the Western powers, led by the US, could basically control Africa through economic means alone, more or less. The rise of China changed this situation permanently. Now, African countries do have an alternative to seeking finance and trade with the West. They can get it from China. And China, especially since 2000, has been stepping up its involvement on the African continent massively, offering much more favorable terms of trade to African countries, coming with infrastructure, investment and so on. So the Western powers are now trying to claw back what they have lost economically in Africa, using the one field in which they do have a competitive edge over China still, which is the military. They're using military means to claw back what they've lost economically. So this is the context in which Africom was established in 2008. Africom means the African Command of the US military. Its basic role is to coordinate US military activities on the African continent. Now the strange thing about Africom is that at present it only has, I think I'm right in saying, 1,500 US troops working for it. Now, as we all know, the Western powers prefer, wherever possible, to get other people from other countries to do the fighting, killing and dying for them. The one main lesson they've learned from Iraq and Afghanistan is that wars in which their own citizens are killed are not popular. So, part of the aim of Africom is to integrate the African Union forces into a global military structure led by the US. In other words, to subordinate the African Union's forces under a US chain of command. Now, the African Union obviously was not very keen on this idea when it was first established. In fact, Africom was not able to secure any African country in which to put its headquarters. It had to establish its headquarters, quite humiliatingly, in Stuttgart in Germany in 2008. The resistance to Africom in the main on the African continent was mainly led and spearheaded by Libya under Gaddafi's rule. He was actually paying African countries basically to refuse to cooperate with Africom. He was offering investment, infrastructure and cash to countries who refused to host a US base on their soil and who refused to cooperate with Africom. So Libya under Gaddafi was really the biggest obstacle to this plan of subordinating the African Union forces to Africom. So with Gaddafi out of the way now, what we would expect to see is this plan rolling full steam ahead, or as far as possible, and that is exactly what we do see. Since, if we look at what's happened in relation to Africom and the African Union since last August with the fall of Tripoli, when Gaddafi lost power, and especially since his assassination, his murder in October of last year, we can see this has been happening very clearly. So it's no coincidence, the very same month that Gaddafi was murdered, President Obama announced 100 special forces would be sent to 4 different African countries, ostensibly to try and hunt down Joseph Kony from the Lord's Resistance Army in Uganda. Now we know that's a load of nonsense. For one thing, the Ugandan army is basically largely not in Uganda, it's in Somalia, fighting a proxy war for the US along with Ethiopian and Kenyan forces in Somalia. So the US Special Forces in Uganda are basically training Ugandan troops to fight on their behalf in Somalia. In September, another further 2,000 Ugandan troops left Uganda for Somalia. December, I think, of last year, the 2012 plan for Africom was announced. 14 major joint operations exercises between Africom and African countries were announced. March just gone, March 2012, there was something called the African Partnership Station, which is a US and African naval training program, had their what's called initial planning meeting in Germany in March of this year. Now their official press release said, and this is a quote from the Deputy Programs Director of Africom, said they want to move from a training-based program to, quote, real-world operations. So clearly they're rolling full steam ahead with the integration of African Union forces in fighting US proxy wars on the continent. The coming colonial wars against Africa, the idea is they'll be fought by Africans themselves. Even, we've seen very soon after the fall of Libya, in Mali there was a coup. The coup leader was one of the people trained under one of these Africom training programs. It's all starting to look very much like the infamous School of Americas, where Latin American soldiers were sent and trained in America to learn torture techniques, and then went back, overthrew democratically elected governments, ran torture programs with the CIA like Operation Condor. This is Africom's starting to look like the very same kind of thing. Now the School of Americas program is being defeated by the Latin Americans, by unity of the Latin Americans, who are just one after another starting to evict the US bases, stop sending their soldiers to the School of Americas, and reject cooperation with US military. So I very much hope this is the way that the African Union is going to pursue this issue, because it really is a crunch time now for the African Union. It was only formed in 2002, and what the European powers and the US are basically trying to do is strangle it at birth, prevent it from becoming the independent organization that it is still capable of becoming. But that means resisting all cooperation of Africom, massively stepping up all relations with other countries in the global south, including Brazil and China and other countries that don't have a track record of exploiting and oppressing and using their military in Africa. And it also means maximum unity against the coming imperial wars in Africa. So I hope that that is on the agenda. It's still a very real possibility, but the problem is, since Libya, the plans for the military reconquest of Africa are rolling full steam ahead and need maximum unity to resist them. Thank you.